and thank you very much for inviting me here. This is my first time in Louisville, and it's really beautiful, so thank you. So I have this title, Is There a Place for Race in Medicine? And this title was suggested to me when I was invited to speak or shortly after. And I like it. It's a nice, catchy title. And so I kept it. Except that, and I kept it also because I think this is a question that lots and lots of people are asking right now. And as many of you know, if not all of you, there's a lot of dispute right now in the biomedical literature, in the medical literature about what role race should play both for clinical physicians and for researchers. So, and this dispute, which I am sometimes in the middle of, gets pretty heated sometimes. I've had colleagues tell me that that one's just crazy, and that one doesn't know what he's talking about or she's talking about. So I think this exact question is being asked a lot. My feeling about this question is that it's not exactly the right question. I would rather ask what is the place of race in medicine, or what are the places of race in medicine, because I think race can function in more than one way, both in research and in clinical care. And so rather than asking the question, sort of setting it up as an all or nothing dichotomy, is there a place, and the expected answer is yes or no, my answer to that is sometimes yes and sometimes no. So I prefer this kind of a question here. And some related questions that I think are in some ways behind a lot of the debate right now. What is the significance of current scientific findings about human variation and difference and similarity, particularly genetics? How can we improve health and healthcare, particularly for those who are least well off? And particularly in light of all of the data we have developed on health disparities. We seem to be really good at finding them. We don't seem to be nearly as good at fixing them or diminishing them. How are science and law influencing racial attitudes and racial hierarchies in the United States? I'm really not going to talk a lot about this. This is sort of my current interest right now, the area I'm moving my own research into. But that's not what I'm going to talk about a lot right now. I think also this controversy about racial differences is really being brought out into the public. And one of the ways it's being brought out into the public is with the announcement of this drug, Bidil. It's being touted as the first drug that will be approved for treating African Americans in heart failure. And it's sort of being touted as the first racially targeted drug to be approved. That's maybe sort of true. But over 40 drugs have been approved with, as part of their FDA approval, some kind of labeling restriction with respect to, or labeling warning with respect to the efficacy, differential efficacy of the drug in people of different ancestries or racial or ethnic backgrounds. But nonetheless, this one has garnered lots and lots of attention. There's lots of media and marketing hype around it. And partly there's lots of media and marketing hype around it because they have framed their production, their research on this drug as this is a drug that is designed to address an important health disparity, right? And so part of what is behind this is this belief, things we all know about race in medicine. I call it things we all know. Some of the things we all know about race in medicine, what you hear a lot, African Americans die from heart failure at twice the rate of European Americans or white Americans. Actually, that statistic, so my friend and colleague Jonathan Kahn spent a lot of time tracking down that statistic to discover whether that was really true, because it's at the basis of a lot of the hype about Bidil. And it turns out that statistic is more or less not true. So data from the CDC place the age-adjusted ratio of black-white mortality from heart failure at 1.1 to 1. The 2-to-1 ratio is true, I think, for men under 65, which is, as it turns out, in the absolute, a very, very, very small number of people, whether they're white, black, or other. Right? But this kind of claim, things we all know in the medical community, we all know that black people die of heart failure twice as often as whites do. That claim just circulates around out there. People take it up. They include it in the introductions and the discussion sections of their articles. And sort of continues to ramify as folk knowledge in the medical community. Another thing we all know is that black people do not respond well to ACE inhibitors. So I'm taking this statement directly from things that have been said to me when I give grand rounds around the country on this topic. And part of what I wanted to do with this statement is to highlight one of the things I think is a problem about how the concept of race is used in medicine and research, which is the statement, black people do not respond. So suddenly we have a categorical statement that just gets applied to all black people. This categorical statement is actually based on statistical findings. And statistically, the response curves to ACE inhibitors show a different mean. It's not huge, but it's statistically significant. Nonetheless, a very large proportion of African Americans respond quite well to ACE inhibitors. And yet, what gets out into the world, somehow we have a problem translating statistical information into practical clinical knowledge. And so this is, if I should actually really keep count of how many times I've heard that claim. So there are things we all know, and there are things that many of us do and accept when it comes to race in medicine. One of the things we do is we attribute every observed racial difference or difference in health outcome to a genetic cause. And so you can read through the medical literature, and some friends of mine have done this in a more systematic way. Richard Cooper and Jay Kaufman have published a number of articles in which they document in various ways the number of times that some observed difference is that we infer that the cause must be genetic. Or we do what they call the subtraction method of making inferences, where we see an observed difference, we measure two socioeconomic variables, and those don't, when we do our statistics, those don't take out all the variability between black and white or Asian and white. And so we say, well, we control for socioeconomic status, what's left must be caused by genes, right? And I urge you all to read Jay and Richard. They have a whole series of articles in which they do a very detailed critique of this kind of methodology or lack thereof, both the logic and sort of research design problem. At any rate, okay, so we tend to attribute observed racial differences in health and medical outcomes to genetic differences, and I've just actually here given some examples of what I think of as very long-lived versions of that. The slavery hypertension hypothesis, the widely accepted but without pretty much any justification research-wise hypothesis that starts out African Americans have higher blood pressure on average, more African Americans have higher blood pressure than white Americans at similar ages. The explanation must be genetic. And if the explanation is genetic, where did this genetic difference come from? And that question became particularly prominent after people realized, well, back in Africa, people who are closely related to African Americans don't necessarily have high blood pressure. So then they had to come up with an explanation for why African Americans might be genetically predisposed to high blood pressure. And based on various things, one person hypothesized that it was part of the transport of slaves and the practice of slavery that people who couldn't conserve salt either died during transport in slave ships or died while working as slaves or were less likely to survive and reproduce. So now we have a whole just so story to explain why black people are genetically predisposed to have hypertension, except for the fact that we actually don't have any evidence that black people are genetically predisposed or that there are systematic genetic differences between black people and other people in the United States that would explain this finding. And what we do know is that a lot of this original kind of historical data that was used to support the slavery hypertension hypothesis turns out not to be correct in terms of how many people died during slave transport and so forth. We know that people with quite similar genetic backgrounds who are black, if they are in Africa, they tend to have the lowest blood pressure. If they are in Europe or in the Caribbean, they tend to have slightly higher blood pressure at similar ages. And if they are in the United States, they have yet higher blood pressure. So the explanation for high blood pressure is probably not about genetic differences, between black people and white people in the United States. Nonetheless, the tendency to have this whole story about genetic differences is very strong, and to accept those stories without, they make sense to us, so we don't question them a lot of times. And I have some theories about why we have these sort of incorrect inferences that every observed difference has a genetic cause. One of them just has to do with the difficulty of translating statistical concepts. And one of them is, I think there's a kind of syllogism at play here. And I've tried to map out just one simplistic version of what kind of logic or thought processes may be going on. But one of the things that happens is that we have folk beliefs about race. Everybody does. And those folk beliefs incorporate the idea that races are like natural kinds, that races are fundamentally, naturally, pervasively different categories of human beings. And we also have beliefs about genetics, that genes are the sort of primary determinant of natural and fundamental aspects of our identities, both individually and group-wise. We're already kind of predisposed, if you will, culturally, to believe that there are these really distinct categories of people and that genes and ancestry define those distinctions. So I think we had beliefs about race, and when we got more sophisticated about genetics, it was easy to plug genes in as the kind of cause of racial differences. And so then when we see racial differences, we just assume, well, because races are genetically different, we assume, then the differences that we see in health outcomes and so forth, it must be that they have a genetic cause, that these health disparities are natural, that they're pervasive, and they're racial, so they must have genetic causes, just like everything about race. I don't know if that's really what's going on, but it seems as though something like that is going on. So because there are lots of beliefs about genetics and race, I wanted to really quickly review some of the recent scientific findings, because this is another reason why there's a lot of controversy. We have data. Most people aren't questioning the data, but the interpretations of the data are radically different, and the implications of the different interpretations are important, I think. So we started out in the 1990s with the Human Genome Project with a story about genetic similarity. After all, this is why we could come up with a model human genome, is because, in fact, human beings are very genetically similar, much more so than almost any other organism, certainly than other mammals, most other mammals. So you probably all heard this before. Human beings are 99.9% alike when we compare one to another. Another way of saying that is that any two unrelated people, on the average, will differ from each other approximately one nucleotide out of every 2,000 or 1,000 nucleotides. Humans are an evolutionarily young species. There haven't been that many generations of human beings. Most of the sort of development of human beings and evolution took place in Africa. We haven't been out of Africa very long. So we haven't had that much time to develop genetic differences among each other. And there haven't ever been human groups that were reproductively isolated for long enough to create what would be called subspecies. When we look at other organisms, their population geneticists have definitions of subspecies, and it usually has to do with something like, I think, 25% variation in allele frequency between two populations of the same species is considered a subspecies. Human beings don't come anywhere near that, probably because we haven't been separated in any particular small group long enough to have that kind of genetic variation emerge. So we had this story about genetic similarity, and that was all very comforting, except that after we finished the model human genome, what we wanted to do with it was use it to look for genetic differences that might explain medical problems, right? And so now we have to start searching for genetic differences, and right away people become nervous. And of course, even though we're all 99.9% alike, that 0.1% translates into lots of base pairs, or lots of bases, approximately 3 million, between any two unrelated people. So in the grand scheme of a whole genome, 3 million is a small percent, but it's still a large number when we think about it. we can evaluate genetic differences between two individuals or between two groups. And for reasons, technical, scientific reasons that I won't go into, doing large-scale genetics where we use thousands and thousands of unrelated individuals in a sample, scientists want to know whether the different groups of people who might all end up in that sample, or people from different groups, whether there are background things about patterns of genetic variation that might bias this research. So we don't have to go into detail about that, just to say that comparing genetic difference between groups, or the patterning of the genetic variation between two groups, has become a big project among human population geneticists. So what do we know? A lot of this we know, and we've known for a long time. A lot of this we've known from anthropology, and we knew since the early 20th century. And so geneticists are essentially reconfirming, in many ways, what anthropologists already knew, which was that most human genetic variation is clinal. That means it varies gradually from one population to the next, and that it varies according to geographic distance. So that populations that are located geographically close together tend to have more genetic similarity in their allele frequencies than as you get further apart. You have, populations that are close together have less genetic variation in their allele frequencies. As you get further away, you have more. There aren't sharp genetic discontinuities at continental boundaries. The kind of geographical ancestry version of race might suggest that if sort of races are natural types, that you would have a lot of alleles that might all suddenly shift as you crossed a continental boundary and you went from a population in Africa to a population in the Middle East somewhere. But we don't see that. So this is my graphic representation of clinal variation in a two-allele system, because when I just flash up there an actual map, which if you go into textbooks, you can find these all over the place, right? Depictions of clinal variation in allele frequency of some allele. But they're kind of confusing. And I put this up here for a reason. Each of these lines depicts a population. And going this way, we've got geographic distance from each other. So you can just imagine this is, southern Europe, and you're moving north, and you're sampling a population and looking at the allele frequency of this two-allele marker. And if you just, walk a few miles north from one population, from this population to that population and sample, you might see a little tiny difference in the allele frequency in these two populations, but might not be statistically significant. On the other hand, if you walked, 1,000 miles north, and if you got from population A here to population B, you are going to find a statistically significant difference in allele frequency. That doesn't mean, though, that there is some kind of sharp discontinuity. That's in allele frequencies. That's a sampling issue, right? And so one of the questions we have is, if we see differences by race in allele frequency, which we do in many cases, in some cases at least, what's the significance of that? Does that mean that you have these two really distinct genetic types of human beings? No, not necessarily at all. Often what it means is we're sampling people whose ancestors came from different parts of the world. So we're sampling very distinct places on a clinal continuum. It's not always the only or entire explanation, but it's often the explanation. So I just want to say this. We know that there's much more within group than between group genetic variation. We've known that for 25, 30 years at least. Of that 0.1% of genetic variation between human beings, approximately 85%, between 85% or 90% is within any population. Certainly within any racial group, but even within any much smaller population than that. 7 to 15% between any two groups, even within a continent, and only about 4 or 5% probably is sort of between groups on different continents. So again, if we think about genetic variation and we think about continental ancestry as somehow definitive of race, which I don't think it is, but that's how it's often used, that's not where most of the genetic variation between people actually is. All right? Yes?
A question about that slide. Are you talking about given the genetic variation that there is, 85% of the 3 million.
Exactly, yeah. So basically, we're 99.9% alike. So when we talk about genetic variation, we're only talking about that 1.1% of the genome that varies. But sometimes we get so much focus on genetic variation and clustering people into different clusters and whatever, that we sort of forget that all of that discussion of genetic variation is against this background of we are 99.9% alike. And also that almost all of that 0.1% of variation is within any group. So we can't look within any group and think, oh, these people are all they're all genetically alike because they're all members, they're all from the same country. Human groups, the variation we have is fairly uniformly, it's not uniformly distributed, but it is distributed in all the groups. Okay, actually, I'm going to just skip a lot of this for a second. I just want to go to this slide for a sec. I should say, so I've said that trying to understand how variation is patterned is a big project right now, population geneticist. And we've had a number of reports of the ability to take a whole bunch of genetic markers and have the computer search for patterns and cluster people with similar patterns together in one cluster. And in some of those reports, they are clustering, the computer will, if you don't tell it what continent someone's ancestors came from, it will cluster almost all the people from one continent together into one cluster and separate them from people from a different continent. And some people, for instance, Nicholas Wade of the New York Times, have said, oh, look, this shows that race is a real genetic thing. I would say a little bit more on that later, but I also just wanted to show that it's much more complicated than it's often made out both in the popular press and even in the scientific press. And I love this study. It's a study of people in Brazil. And what they did was they took some genetic markers that they could use. They looked at ancestral populations, or as close to ancestral populations as they could get. So one, they went to Portugal, to a village that they knew that a lot of the conquistadors had come from that region of Portugal. That's represented over here. Those were essentially their white people. Then they went to Africa, and they went to Sao Tome, which is the island where the Portuguese slave traders, they collected up the Africans, and that was their staging area for the boats to take off. And so it turns out there is a population of people on Sao Tome who were basically the ones left behind when the slave trade ended. So that they use that as sort of the ancestral population of African people who were brought to Brazil, right? And they found some genetic markers that could basically cluster all the white people from Portugal in a separate cluster from all the black people from Sao Tome. And then they started looking in Brazilians. And they had people identify themselves and also have an attributed racial identity. And they divided them into black, white, and in between. And what this shows is that there's some proportion of the white Brazilians who genetically, using these markers that were sort of defined by these separated, European population from Portugal and African population from Sao Tome, as distinguishing black from white, in a sense, right? But in Brazil, a lot of the white people would actually cluster, or some of the white people would actually cluster with the black people. A fair number of the black people would actually cluster with the white people. And you can't really tell by looking at somebody what their sort of ancestry is going to look like genetically. Okay? That is the really important take-home message of the slide. And these so-called people who were intermediate, and the ones who were intermediate was actually because either two people looking at them couldn't agree on how to define them racially, or they defined themselves as being somewhere in between, which in Brazil, they don't necessarily use the same racial categorizations that we do here. And they do have a much sort of broader conception and more and less discrete conception of variation. So this brings out a couple of points. One is that you can't impute genetic ancestry so easily by looking at somebody, especially not in a country like ours or a country like Brazil. Another one is that there's color and race are not necessarily the same thing, right? So there are people who maybe look white but have might not identify as white, might have lived in a different context than white. There are people whose race changes depending on where they're living. Their color doesn't change, their features don't change, but their race changes. And so, for instance, one of the things the authors of this article point out is that white, by genetics, being European American or having a lot of European identified genes or alleles doesn't necessarily correlate with looking like you're a European ancestry person, right? Okay, so anyway, I would also say that we now have a lot of evidence about this sort of all these clustering activities, and it is often presented as this is a really objective way of categorizing people, but in fact, this is statistics, and it's just statistics, and how people get clustered together or not depends on, it's very contingent, and depends on what genetic markers are examined, how many markers are examined, what kinds of genetic markers. And by marker, all I mean is any place in the genome where two people might differ from each other. It depends on the relative and actual size of the subgroups within the total population, the amount of genetic heterogeneity within any subgroup, and the overall sort of composition of the study sample, where in the world people were sampled from. There are there also are lots of actually assumptions, statistical assumptions, that are also built into these clustering engines. So there's a really nice article out there where the authors changed just one assumption, and they take some previous data and showed that people who look like they clustered separately all of a sudden don't cluster separately anymore, just by changing one statistical assumption. All right. So really, I think the important question is, what is the significance of all of this clustering activity? And we have some different views on this in the scientific community. So this is really the Neil Risch view for those who read in this literature. Neil Risch has been sort of the biggest proponent of using race and ethnicity as surrogates for genetic patterning when doing research. And so he pretty much claims that racial and ethnic categories are the major determinant of genetic patterning, at least in the US. And opposing him in the literature quite often is Richard Cooper, who doesn't think that all this clustering is necessarily indicative of anything important in the real world. I would add to that Walter Bodmer, who just the other day at a conference at Stanford said, these clusters are meaningless if we're actually talking about anything out in nature. So I just give that as a caution. I don't know that I am at this point the best person in the world to say how important these clusters, the fact that we can make these clusters, how important that is in terms of understanding anything out there in the world. But it's often spoken about even in the popular press as though this proves that there are these natural genetic types out there, and that we shouldn't accept that. We have to be careful and remember that statistical significance is not the same as medically meaningful. One of my questions with all this clustering is, whether it's for research purposes or clinical purposes, if we want to use race or ethnicity to capture something about genetic background and impute something about genetic variation, is this the best way to do it? As opposed to asking, for instance, about someone's ancestry. It's not, so whether or not statistics shows you something, that's not really what we always care about. We want to know, is it medically meaningful? Let's see. We have to be really careful. I think this is happening a lot, that there's this tendency to say these people cluster together, they're all genetically alike. No, they cluster together because of something about a whole pattern of allelic variation across their genome, and it doesn't mean that they're necessarily genetically very much alike. And in fact, some of these clusters are pretty clearly residuals. It's just that the computer stuck this group together because it didn't fit in any other group, right? So we have to be really careful not to, again, take that sort of racial mythology of people who are of any race being a sort of homogeneous class in which they have many, many things where they are alike each other and different from other people. No, we have to be careful not to kind of impose that on these clusters, and I'm seeing that happen. Another thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that the people of Africa are the most genetically diverse. And you see it in the medical literature in the US all the time, but it's true not just in the medical literature, that as a social matter, African Americans, black people, are the most raced people socially in terms of the social hierarchies of race. And yet, genetically, it makes the least sense to lump together black people as a kind of single genetic category. There is more genetic variation among black people than any other group of people. So we should keep that in mind. All right, so this is sort of, actually, it's not just my summary. It's a summary that I came up with about 7 or 8 scientists who've been working in this field. And we were trying to figure out, like, how could we summarize the findings in ways that would not be, that no one would really find too contentious, that everybody, no matter what side of this debate they were on, they could probably agree this is an accurate summary. So here it is. Human variation is continuous, genetic variation, that is, not discrete. And in fact, human variation of all kinds. Trait variation is continuous. That's what anthropologists discovered a long time ago. The clustering of populations is another way of drawing arbitrary lines, essentially, within this continuous variation. There's more variation within groups than between groups. Overall, people are similar to those nearby, or they're more similar to those nearby and different from those far away. And existing racial classification is historical and political. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that race is a chimera. So I just want to be really clear about that. I'm not saying that race doesn't exist or it's a chimera. I'm just saying that it's not a natural type. It's not some special genetic category that infuses our identity in ways that nothing else does. But if race isn't, some special genetic category, then why use it in medicine at all? Or in research, and how should we use it? Because underlying this debate has been the assumption that if race is not a sort of special genetic category, a lot of scientists have basically said, well, we shouldn't use race because it's not a special genetic category. And I think that's too simple a way of thinking about this. There are times and places and ways to use race that can be helpful both in research and in medicine. So I think our questions need to be, why should we use race, and how should we use it when we use it? And some of the whys I just have, this is like almost my last slide. Some of the whys have to do with the fact that sometimes we can't directly measure social or biological features for which race is a proxy. If we can measure them, we should try to do that, because we're getting at the more fundamental causes, if you will. But we can't always measure them. We don't always know what to look for. So sometimes race is the best thing we have as a proxy, even if it's not all that great. Also, I think that living as a person of a particular race and gender in this country can have perhaps cumulative biological effects that wouldn't be easily decomposed into separate variables that you could measure at any particular time in a study. Some of that we're starting to get at things like looking about what happened to people's parents and grandparents, looking at what was going on in their mother's lives during gestation. There are some ways to get at some of these sort of long-term effects, but I think there might be cumulative effects that are not so easily decomposed into separate variables. So those were just some of the why reasons. And finally, this is another one, which is discovering how people identify racially can guide a physician or a researcher into asking important questions. So my example for this, I was telling Mark earlier, whenever I go around the country, I always ask physicians how they use race, and I ask researchers how they use race. And I was talking to a group of dermatologists, and I don't know anything about dermatology, so I asked them, when and how do you use race in your practice? And they said, well, actually, it's very important because we're in Los Angeles. This was at UCLA. We're in Los Angeles, and we see a lot of people who, first of all, we couldn't really necessarily say what race they were by looking at them. They could be black, they could be Latino, they could, they could be Native American. We don't know. But we try and ask them how they identify racially because that has a lot to do with what kind of skincare and hair care products they use, and that is important for us to know. And if they identify as a certain race, then we ask more about certain kinds of hair care products that they might be using, for instance, or skincare products that they might be using, or herbal medications that they might be using. And so knowing how somebody thinks about their race guides us in asking other important medical questions. And I love that answer because it was something I would have never thought of, and yet, based on personal experience, I realized, oh, of course that's true. I mean, I know this. All right, so those are some of the why answers, some of the how answers. How to use race, I think, is when we use it and we see racial differences, we shouldn't infer genetic causes when we don't have data for that. Rather than inferring genetic causes, we should wait until we actually can sort of show them or demonstrate them or prove them. We shouldn't use it as a proxy for information that we otherwise could get anyway, such as ancestry. In fact, for a lot of genetic diseases, it's not knowing that someone's white. It's knowing whether they have ancestors who are Ashkenazi Jewish or Finnish or something else, right? That's not race. That's a more specific thing about ancestry. Don't overgeneralize. It's not necessarily the case that all white people are just like all other white people, and all black people are just like all other black people, or that some finding is going to be generalizable to an entire race of people. So we need to be careful about that. Know what you're trying to learn about when you ask about race or try to discover something about someone's race. Are you trying to understand something about their ancestry? Are you trying to understand something about their diet or their cultural practices or whatever? Be clear about what it is that you're trying to find out and that you're trying to do when you use racial categories. And then this is my last slide. Be aware of what's at stake. Because I think, first of all, one of the things that concerns me the most about medicine and about research is that we get so focused on race as a cause rather than perhaps an effect. We get so focused on race that we fail to do research or even ask the right questions in a clinical setting. We fail to get other information that would have actually been more useful to us, right? Race is one way of dividing up the variation among human beings, variation genetically, culturally, variation in power relationships. Race is one way of dividing up the spectrum of variation, but it's not the only way, and it may not be the best way for any particular purpose, right? And I do fear that we get so focused on it that we don't ask the more important questions. There really is a danger of reinvigorating these kind of folk notions of races as natural types and of giving support to negative stereotypes, the exact stereotypes about people of color being somehow genetically inadequate or biologically unsound, more prone to disease. If you look back at the early 20th century, right, there's a whole history of this. Medicine and science attempt, the problem as it was set out is, what's wrong with black people that they are getting more tuberculosis, as opposed to what are the living conditions that cause the transmission of tuberculosis to be higher in this group of people. So I think that when we use race in medicine and science, this is always a danger. It's always a danger, and especially in genetics, just because of the folk beliefs that are already out there about race. So I'm one of those people who says sometimes it's okay to use, sometimes maybe the best to use race, sometimes not, but just use it carefully. And that's it. Thank you.
I have two questions/comments. My first one is, not to make you go back, but the slide about there's more genetic variation among, I believe the slide said African people.
African-descended people, yeah.
Okay, I was going to ask you, how is the group defined? Because then later on the slide said, or we used the word we were discussing about it, black. Is that self-identified? How did you define,
right.
How is that group of people defined?
Repeat the question because it will pick up on the word.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the question is, when on the slide that has to do with there we go. So the slide says that people of Africa are the most genetically diverse. That literally is we went to Africa and did research.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So then I have African American or black people are the most racialized people because I don't think we can talk about race as a general thing. Race is very, very context specific. So race in the United States is not the same as race in Brazil. So that's why I have African Americans here. And African Americans certainly genetically, historically, ancestrally don't represent all of Africa. It is also true, though, that in many, many, many studies, African Americans have far more alleles, far more haplotypes than anybody else who's been studied in the United States. And one of the real problems with all this work, actually, is that most of the markers were defined in European background populations. And so we don't even capture, we're missing a lot of the genetic variation that is among African-descended people, or recently African-descended people, since we're all African-descended. We're missing a lot of variation that is there.
Okay, can I ask one more? Not to hog the floor, but so when you're
done after this.
When you're talking about the dermatologist, I have to comment on that because I loved your idea that there are multiple reinforcing factors, and that's what race might really be the proxy for. That there's a continuum and ongoing interplay of factors. But then when the dermatologists say we want to know what skincare hair care products to use, my response to that is, isn't that exactly the situation where they should be asking the question, what skincare or hair care products to use? When you know what the concrete medical information or contextual information you need is, isn't the, from an ethical perspective, I'm much more concerned about the situation where we're using race as that proxy for all the socio-cultural things that happen.
I agree.
Summarizer.
Right. I agree that using race as a proxy for all of these socio and cultural and behavioral variables that you could, when you could directly ascertain those variables, is very often not a good idea. So that's why I said it can guide a physician or researcher in asking other medically relevant questions, because I do think that there's a sort of limited amount of time, especially physicians. You go down a sort of decision tree of the kinds of questions you need to ask. And so what I got from them was not that if somebody tells me they're Latino or they identify themselves as Chicana, I don't then assume that obviously they're going to a codon data and they're using certain herbal remedies. But I know to ask some questions about herbal remedies if they've told me they're Chicana in relation to a particular thing that I'm seeing, right? And that might not be as high on my list of questions to ask if somebody says, I'm Native American. Or I might ask about a different set of herbal remedies, really raise that. Because physicians have to cue people. I had this experience. I went to the doctor and they said, oh, what medications are you taking? And I said, none. And then a minute, because when they asked medications, I was thinking prescription medications. That's what came into my mind. And then, I just sort of mentioned that I was using an over-the-counter antihistamine. And the nurse looked at me and she said, are you taking any other medication? And I realized, my thought processes and hers were just not tracking quite together. And so, there are ways in which physicians and other healthcare professionals need to cue people. And knowing how somebody thinks about themselves racially may help you to do that. But I agree, you shouldn't just assume, oh, they obviously use X hair care product if they tell me that they're African American. Yeah.
All right, I'm done.
I have a question. One of the problems that I think we have in using race and also ethnicity is that both researchers and clinicians use the terms so sloppily in some cases that it destroys any value that you might have in using that information. So you don't see it as much today, but certainly 10 years ago you saw lots of studies that said high frequency of X found in Asian population, and as if there was a population from Asia. Now it might say high frequency of X found in Chinese population.
Right.
Well, that's a little better, but that's still not great. What sort of steps do you think need to be taken to make the use of any sort of place terminology adequate scientifically and then socially?
Right. First of all, I agree with you that there is a lot of, that there's very sloppy usage of race and ethnicity terminology. And clearly one of the things we've seen is because people are afraid of the R word, they use the term ethnicity, and yet the categories in their data sets are really race categories, right? That's very prevalent even today. I have a couple of responses to this. One is, this is why we have to be very careful about generalizing ever, right? When we're talking about data that we've gathered that is somehow tied to a race or ethnicity variable. I don't think that we should try for uniformity of categories. And the reason is because race is a historical thing, right? And so, for instance, right now there's a big dispute in the United States about, is Hispanic a race? Because in fact, in parts of the United States, people of Mexican descent or people of other Latin American descent not only think of themselves as a distinct race, but are treated as a distinct race. In other parts of the United States, that's not so true. And so this whole thing in the census, right, about, it turns out that in the other category for race, it's like 94% Hispanics who don't want to say, they don't want to put themselves into I'm white or I'm black, and then just use ethnicity as a separate thing. And they are sort of actively refusing that, right? But it's because of a particular historical experience, and that's a different historical experience than African Americans have had in this country, or than various people of different Asian immigration waves have had in this country. So I don't think that we can have uniformity of categories in a sense. I think the categories need to be responsive to the way they've developed. But partly what that means is that we have to be able to specify who we're sampling when we talk about race or ethnicity. And that's always a trade-off between certain kinds of perhaps anonymity issues or collective anonymity issues. You know, there could be times if you are studying some Native American tribe where they don't want to be identified by the name of the tribe and the particular location of the reservation for good reasons. So there is some trade-off between specifying very carefully who it is that you're studying and some of the other ethical concerns. But I think, you know, as researchers in particular, specifying who is being sampled, what your sampling strategy is, as well as you can, given, you know, the confidentiality constraints, is the best way around this. And there's some move towards that. It's gotten better, a little bit better, but it could get a lot better. Yes?
Following up on the last question, do you think that it would help to clarify the terminology and the use of the terminology if instead of using race as a noun, we used race as a modifier, and so speak in terms of racialized groups in order to forefront the socially constructed nature of that category?
There are some people who strongly advocate that position. In fact, I'm trying to remember whose work I was reading, who basically says there are no races, only racialized groups, and that those are two very different things. My suspicion is that we could talk about racialized groups. They would still be treated the same way. You know, it's kind of like the switch from race to ethnicity. You know, that might have been a good idea if people actually collected any data on, like, the cultural context of their research subjects, but in fact, most of them don't. So they're really still treating the groups as kind of essentialized, naturalized groups, whether they call it race or they call it ethnicity. And that's what I'm most concerned about. Now, I do think language matters, so it might help a little. I mean, one of the things I try to do is I actually always try to say, like, European American people, or African American people, or black people and white people, as opposed to just saying blacks and whites, because even though it's a really trivial thing, there's something to me that feels more, I don't know, respectful and less essentializing to actually, sort of make sure it's all human beings, kind of. But, that's just my small way of trying to use language to make a little inroad. So.
Okay, I have one last question. This will be my last question. From your experience teaching medical students, and from what you've said about the problem as it pervades medicine, when do you think is the most appropriate time in medical education to have these sort of discussions? And do you have any suggestions on how it can be done most effectively?
Wow. I think you have to have these sorts of discussions over and over and over again. Because race comes up in so many different ways, and because we need constant reminding. The folk beliefs about race are so deeply ingrained in our consciousnesses and in our institutions and in the people we interact with that I think we do need constant reminding. But I also think one of the problems is that there are very few people in medical schools who actually have ever thought about race theory, the history of, sort of the role that medicine and science played in developing notions of race. And so there are very, very few people who can teach this and any of it. And so I think we need to start with the faculty, and we need to be having continuous discussions with the faculty, because I actually sometimes get from medical students, I'll get comments like, wow, we tried to talk about this in our genetics class and it was so confusing. Now, tell me who else I can read, because I found, they would say that they found the lecture that I gave to at least help dispel some of their confusions, but what else can I read, they'll say, or something, But it's clear that a lot of attempts to talk about race they don't diminish the problem and may even make it worse. So.
I have a hunch, it's only a guess, that one of the problems that may be so difficult to teach this in medical school is because all the other medical education is geared toward a kind of biological reductionism in a way, that all the action is at the biological level. And so what you do then is you look for some kind of racial differences at the genetic level, and if you can't find those, then you still have, when you're using words like race, which go proxy for socioeconomic conditions and culture and things like that, you still have the tendency to think of them as natural types, which is, again, the kind of biological reductionism. So I think in order to make the point clear, you're going to have to go against a very large tendency within medical education to think only in terms of biology and forget about society and culture.
Right. And I think different medical schools handle that so differently. I used to have, when I worked at the AMA, I used to have lots of interns from Northwestern. And they got very, very intensive training in thinking about health, like the social and cultural dimensions of health, more so than any other place I've ever been. I think at UW we're not as good as Northwestern, but we are better at this than some of the other medical schools I've been around. So I think that really varies. I do think actually there are some tactics that some medical schools have instituted. One, I just heard this recently, I think it's Columbia. When they're seeing patients, they never give a racial identifier unless it's important to their case presentation. So, I mean, one of the things that many people have pointed out is that it somehow race, gender, age are just the sort of three ways of identifying patients that became habitual in the medical community, and so people do it without thinking about it. So at Columbia, what they've done is say, we don't use a racial identifier unless there's a reason to do that. And so you have to actually think about it and justify it and explain it when you do it. And that actually, I think, is probably a very good practice, because it does sort of constantly make people go, oh yeah, why am I doing this?
If there are no other questions, Pilar, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was very